Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. Thank you, Charlie, for that introduction, and thank you, Brookings, for hosting this event. We really appreciate it. And thanks to Jim for joining me today to discuss the evolving electric power industry. So we are IEI, the Institute for Electric Innovation, is actually the foundation arm of the Edison Electric Institute. Our members are the investor-owned electric utilities all across the U.S. We also have about 30 technology partners, from very large companies like GM and IBM and Oracle to very small startups that are working with electric utilities in the transformation of the power sector. So in June, IEI released this book that we're here to talk about today, Thought Leaders Speak Out on the Evolving Electric Power Industry. This is a collection of essays from utility executives, technology company executives, state utility regulators, and other stakeholders. These essays were based on an event that we held here in Washington, D.C. in March called Powering the People, Connected Conversations. I view the transition of the power sector in three parts: the evolving electric power grid, evolving electricity customers, and evolving electricity regulation. This is how the book is structured in these three sections. And I want to highlight a few points from each section, and then we'll go to the Q&A. In terms of the evolving grid, I see the following trends. First, a more connected grid, a grid that is connected to more and more devices, a grid of things. I also see a more distributed and less centralized grid, a network of power and information flows, rather than one-way flows, with more distributed energy resources and many, many more connections. We also see more renewable energy on the grid, both large-scale wind and solar, as well as small-scale renewables. We are starting to see more storage on the grid, driven primarily by the California storage mandate. And finally, at the edges of the grid, we are starting to see real-time data analytics. So all of these trends are well underway, but storage and real-time data analytics are the latest additions to those trends. In terms of the evolving customers, I see three things. First, safe, reliable, affordable electricity remains the entry-level service. I see growth in sustainable energy, driven by customers. The prime example is just solar. We love solar in this country in all shapes and sizes. Rooftop solar, community solar, large-scale solar farms. All of the forecasts show exponential increases in solar energy over the next few years. Finally, I see residential customers increasingly managing their energy using cool devices like their iPhone, Nest thermostats, and other devices. In terms of the final section of the book, evolving regulation, I also see three trends there. First, the need for more collaboration and conversation among stakeholders and fewer adversarial rate proceedings. Utilities will need to become regulatory entrepreneurs. Second, the need to provide different customers with different services, reliability, affordability, clean energy, etc. And then third is the need for incentives and penalties for utilities based on meeting agreed-upon performance objectives. As I mentioned at the outset, the book includes the perspectives of many, many different stakeholders: electric utility companies, technology companies, regulators, and others. All of these stakeholders have a vested interest in making the transformation of the power sector a success. Why? The electric grid is the infrastructure that enables all of our other essential infrastructures in the U.S. In my view, the U.S. power grid is becoming far more critical to our everyday lives and to our economy than ever before. We are spending billions modernizing the grid to make it do ultimately what we want as a society. Our biggest challenge today is how to evolve regulation to align with the changing role of utilities, the accelerating pace of technology, and ever-increasing customer expectations, while also providing reliable, safe, affordable, and increasingly clean electricity to everyone. I hope I provided some food for thought, and I look forward to the discussion and the Q&A today. Thanks.
So let me, if I may, give you a sense of where we are. You know, the power industry is the most capital-intensive industry in the United States. And it's in the middle of a transformation. I would say that we are just now at the end of the beginning of the transformation. What does that mean? It means, one, that this transformation is going to take a very long time. Two, the actual transformation probably really started. You could go all the way back to 1978 with PURPA and the National Energy Act, but nothing really happened until 1992, and you had the Energy Policy Act that called for a robust wholesale competitive market in the United States. We started down that road. So 92 started to be the accelerator, and let me quickly tell you what has happened. Take the generation segment of the business. You basically, in 19 states, deregulated generation, and we moved to competitive markets in those 19 states. The remainder of the states in the U.S. continued to have vertically integrated, regulated regime in those states. The next thing that occurred is the creation of RTOs, ISOs, where basically the transmission of utilities was operated by a regional entity. So in a sense of the word, utilities lost their monopoly over transmission. They could operate it, but they had to operate it in the context of this regional entity and not solely for their customers. Only 2/3 of the states are in RTOs or ISOs today. And it's really in that context that we're where we are. And when I say we're the end of the beginning, I really mean that, because I think it's going to take another 10 years before we see the complete transformation of the industry. What Lisa's done with this book is remarkable in terms of starting to frame that next frontier of change. The change is going to occur in the context of distribution, in the context of the grid, in the context of customers based on the demands and wishes of customers across this country. The other thing that's happened as we've moved through this period is we've seen the cost of solar fall dramatically. Wind has fallen. The cost of wind turbines has fallen dramatically. The consequence of all this is we have new technologies emerging on the supply side, and Lisa talked a little bit about that, and we're going to go deeper on that in this conversation. But also, during this 23 years, you've seen a significant change in the technologies for consumers. So with that, let me stop, having framed where we are. We're now going to focus in 3 areas: the evolution of the grid, customers, and the regulatory area. Let me ask Lisa, give me just to kind of in a broad way as we go deeper in this, what you see the basic trends are with respect to the evolution of the grid.
Okay. So I think that, as Jim mentioned, we are very focused now as an industry on the distribution system and investing in the distribution system to really do 3 things. Digitize the system and that allow for basically power and information flows to go 2 ways, because we're integrating more and more distributed resources into the system every day. So basically a more digital grid, a more distributed grid, and then the ability to provide customers with the services that they want. So I think of that as sort of the democratization of the grid. And what that means is being able, for customers that want clean energy, you provide clean energy. For customers that want other types of services, you're able to provide those types of services. So we have much more flexibility in what we can do with the power system than we've had in the past.
Talk to me, I mean, when you say digitize, to me, it strikes, there's like 2 set of issues that I'd love you to talk more about. One is we're today primarily an analog grid, and we're moving toward digital. And we're moved away from traditional meters that measure the use to smart meters. Give us a sense of where we are in that transition.
Yeah. We've actually, over the last, say, 6 or 7 years, we've gone from very few smart meters to over almost 60 million smart meters deployed across the U.S. We have that's about 50% of all U.S. households. So those are residential smart meters. For larger customers, those customers really have had smarter meters for a long time. But having that ability to communicate with a residential customer is fairly new. So that's a huge, big trend. The second thing that maybe we don't talk about as much, but we're spending billions of dollars doing it, is we're adding a lot of controls and sensors to the power grid, especially to the distribution network. Because when you think about the grid, in the past, the electric power system has been generate power at these remote locations, at central generation plants, and then push that power through the transmission system, the distribution system, to the end-use customer. Now we have many more distributed resources on the grid, and those things are multiplying. And when I say distributed resources, I just want to say this. I mean all sorts on the demand side and the supply side. On the demand side, it could be efficiency, could be demand response. On the supply side, it could be storage, it could be rooftop solar, and other kinds of things. It could be a microgrid. So just connecting those things and making them work, integrating them efficiently and effectively into the grid requires an investment. So we're seeing a lot of investment in controls and sensors on the grid to manage the two-way power flows that we're seeing, to also manage two-way information flows, but also to make the grid itself, to optimize the grid. So to make the grid itself a more efficient operation.
I guess my question is, utilities can handle millions of random decisions about the use of electricity. Turning on the television, plugging in your computer, plugging in your cell phone. So they're constantly dealing with all these random, unpredictable demands. Mm-hmm. If they can do that, why can't they handle hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of supply sources on the system? And why is it taking so long?
Well, I'm not sure it's taking so long. I'm not sure I would agree with that. I think we're actually seeing a pretty much exponential growth. I mean, as you said earlier, all of these things take time, right? We have 3 or 4 states, Hawaii, California, Arizona, and now, and actually New Jersey, with a tremendous amount of solar. So in terms of, I'm not sure it's taking a long time. It's a learning process.
I get the point that it's a learning process, but the Danes have done pretty good. I mean, Denmark is basically managing 30% renewables on their system. There are days in January where there's 100% of their load, 106% I think is the high number in January, of renewables that came on the grid, and they were able to handle that. Germany has got about 30%, on the way to 33% by 2020. Are they smarter than we are in terms of being able to handle it?
Well, I think the U.S., as you know, it has state regulation of utilities. So a state like Iowa has 40% wind already integrated, and their renewables are growing. So that it really, really varies from state to state. One of the things in the U.S. that we pay attention to is affordability of electricity. And when states, regulators, and utilities are making decisions about moving forward, affordability is a big issue. Germany has witnessed pretty big electricity price increases for their residential customers, on the order of about 50%. We probably would not be okay with that in most states in the U.S.
Could you predict for us where you think the optimal mix of renewables with nuclear and gas and coal, what do you envision an optimal mix at some point in the future?
What we are seeing is the rush to renewables and gas. And the way that's happening primarily due to renewable portfolio standards, state policies that are driving investments in renewable energy.
When you have an industry that's a hybrid industry, with only 19 states in competitive markets, the remainder in very regulated, vertically integrated markets, and only 29 states with renewable portfolio standards, when will we ever get to a point like we were in the late 80s and early 90s when you could talk about an industry that was a homogeneous industry versus kind of a very complex hybrid system?
I don't know how much that's going to change. I mean, we like to think of states here in the U.S. as, sort of experimenting with their own ways of doing things. We've certainly seen that in the power sector. Oh, I should ask you that question, since you were a Duke Energy CEO. The Southeast does not.
It doesn't work that way. I'm asking.
So I would say it's very hard to predict what's going to happen in the rest of the country in terms of the industry structure.
I've always been somebody that believes in the old saying that you need to follow the money. Let's talk about the money in the power sector. How much is being spent on the grid? How much is being spent on solar? Give me a sense of the magnitude of those expenditures.
Yeah, right now we're spending about $90 billion a year in the power sector. That's our CapEx spend across the country. So I did mention some of this earlier. About $20 billion of that is on the distribution system, and we expect that part of our investment to grow over the next several years. The other, I think, important number is what we're spending on solar energy, and that right now is about $9 billion per year, and also expected to remain there for the next 5 or 6 years, about $9 billion per year.
As I listened to your opening comments, you talked about Chris John's Grid of Things. What in the world is Grid of Things?
I think the Grid of Things is a great name for what is actually happening to the grid. Because just as over the past 20 to 30 years, the internet has evolved to do all kinds of things that it didn't do before. We have all these apps that we use that we didn't even know about, 15 years ago. We are seeing many, many more things being connected to the grid. Now, that could be an electric vehicle. That could be a battery, just some storage battery, standalone storage battery. That could be a rooftop solar system. That could be a smart appliance in a house. That could be your thermostat. That could be something that we don't even know about right now. But I think that visual, in my mind, the Grid of Things is the very distributed grid that is enabling all these things to connect to it.
How close are we to that ultimate state where the Grid of Things is the reality in every state in our country?
I think it's all over the place, depending on what state you're in. But again, where we're seeing a lot of growth in distributed energy resources, that it's more of a reality than in states where we're not seeing so much growth in distributed energy resources. And of course, in states where we have smart meters, that is kind of the building block to having this digital grid that is again, connecting different things.
Tell me the challenge in Hawaii. I mean, where are they on distributed generation, solar on the roof? Do they still have the same net metering tariffs that basically subsidize solar? I mean, how does it work there? Because they seem to be the most advanced in the country, even more advanced in California, in terms of the mix of their grid.
Well, one of the reasons that Hawaii took off so fast in terms of rooftop solar is Hawaii, as an island nation, as an island state, actually used oil to generate electricity. So for Hawaii, renewable energy, wind and solar, are cost effective way before, or were cost effective way before they were in other states in the U.S. So we did see rooftop solar take off very, very quickly in Hawaii, and as I mentioned earlier, too quickly for the grid to deal with it. As I understand it from Mike and from others in Hawaii, I mean, they intend to have their renewable resources grow, and they're basically working out some of the kinks in the system.
You know, the whole part of the book focused on customers I found really interesting. You know, the fact is that cost of electricity to the average family is less than 2% of the disposable income of a family. It's very small. Tell me how this works for the average customer.
In my opinion, even if you don't have solar on your rooftop, just this wide interest in renewables and solar energy in the U.S. that I think is a mega trend is getting people just interested, more interested in energy than they would be otherwise. So they pay a little more attention to it. So, I mean, the Nest thermostat is a great example. Would you have predicted that people would go out and buy Nest thermostats and spend a couple $100s to have a nice looking thermostat? Some people love the Nest thermostat. So I think these kinds of, as these technologies develop, there's awareness develops and more interest develops.
I was struck in your comments and in the book, this reference to regulatory entrepreneurs. What in the heck is that?
So what we're starting to see happen around the country is a few pockets of places where stakeholders are getting together and saying, can we figure out a collaborative way to move forward? I mean, one good example of this is the state of Minnesota. It's called the E21 initiative. It's E for energy. It's their vision of the energy future for the state of Minnesota. So it was a voluntary effort, very grassroots. It wasn't mandated by anyone. Stakeholders got together. They are thinking about where does Minnesota want to be and how are we going to get there? And we're not going to get there by sitting in regulatory proceedings and trying to, over a 2-year process, iron out the details. So that's one way to think about a way forward. And I think other people are looking at at a state like Minnesota and saying, maybe that's something we want to do. Another example I'll give is Governor Ritter, the former governor of Colorado. He now has put together a group of stakeholders across several western states. And they're also trying to talk about how do we move the electricity sector forward? How that's going to all play out in terms of regulatory reform, I don't think we know that yet, but I think there's a lot of recognition that things need to change.
You quoted Ralph Cavanagh. And Cavanagh loves to talk about decoupling. What is that, and why is that important to where we are and where we're going?
So now, I mean, we've heard some things as, is decoupling the future? Is this going to work for regulatory reform? I think the answer to that is absolutely not. Decoupling was, in some sense, a Band-Aid to deal with efficiency. It worked for dealing with efficiency. It's resulted in very small, sort of overall, sort of a small socialization of costs is what I would say across customers. But when we start to talk about the kinds of changes that we're seeing today, I think we need fundamental regulatory reform. So people are starting to talk about more performance-based rate-making systems where utilities are incented to do certain things. They have incentives and disincentives. Incentives to perform, and if you don't perform, then there are penalties for not performing. I think decoupling had a very specific purpose, and it was very much about how do we make sure that there's no disincentive to invest in energy efficiency.
One last question. It seems to me that decoupling 2.0 or beyond, because decoupling didn't incent anybody, it just made people indifferent.
Exactly.
And it's really hard to imagine anything in life that happens as a consequence of indifference. Mm-hmm. It appears to me that we ought to be moving to a formula rates, which decoupling is kind of a subset of formula rates. Why is that not a good idea for a next step? And do you think regulators and consumers would embrace a formula rate where they incent utilities to optimize their use of electricity?
I think that is a good idea, and I think that is the conversation. We don't have a lot of that in the U.S. right now. We have a few examples around the country. Commonwealth Edison in Chicago is a good example of one utility with sort of performance-based rates in place. We had that kind of rate making in place in Iowa for quite a long time, but we don't have it across the whole country. But I think that is the way forward. I think that's definitely the way forward.
Great. I've done my best to be tough on Lisa in these questions, probably not so much. Let me, on behalf of Lisa, thank all of y'all for being here. I really appreciate Lisa answering all these questions. It's more fun asking, I might add, than answering. So thank y'all very much for being here.